Welcome to gCaptain Weekly. I'm Sal Mercogliano. I'm an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina, a former merchant mariner, and an instructor in maritime industry policy at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. We're joined by John Konrad, Captain, CEO of gCaptain. And in our new feature, we're going to be kind of reviewing big stories that have happened this past week. And this is our first installment on this series. John, welcome aboard. I think it's a great idea to do this. Anything you want to add before we jump in and start talking?
No, I think this is great. Thanks for doing this. And I apologize for my massive headphones. My kids stole the small ones. So if I look a little goofy, I apologize, but you're going to have to deal with it.
John, it's not those headphones that make you look goofy, just so you know. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So the first story I want to talk about is one that just came out today, as a matter of fact, which is Iran frees South Korean captain, which is kind of not exactly accurate because they freed the captain and the vessel and the crew of a ship that's been held by the Iranians for quite a few months now, since January. This South Korean flag vessel, which got grabbed by the Iranians, the Hankook Chemi, was basically grabbed while it was coming through the Straits of Hormuz by the Iranians, and it largely had to do with a dispute that Iran was having over with South Korea concerning $7 billion worth of funds that were frozen in South Korean banks. So I thought the first thing to kind of talk about here is obviously the importance of the Straits of Hormuz. We've been so focused on Suez and what's been going on with Ever Given, but I thought we'll talk a little bit for a second here about the Straits of Hormuz and why that's so important for everyone out there. So if you want to start with that, and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about the Suez Canal being important waterway. Probably the most important waterway in the world, I would say, would be the Singapore, Malacca Straits, because everything from Asia is going into there. And then most of the traffic continues to Suez. Some goes down to Africa and some goes up to the Persian Gulf. And then out of choke points, it comes out of the Suez, it goes to the Straits of Gibraltar, and then obviously the Panama Canal is another major. So those are probably the top five. You know, you have a few other entering the North Sea and such, surrounding Florida, but those are the major ones. And then the Straits of Hormuz is the most contested in the world. It has probably the largest security concerns and, you know, one of the biggest oil and natural gas. So not only a lot of cargo go through, but also a lot of, potentially explosive cargo plus military.
I think this story is interesting. We pulled up here the archive of all the stories on gCaptain on this. This is a South Korean owned and flagged vessel. So this is a vessel that, is under the ownership of the South Koreans. And I think it was really interesting that, number one, South Korea really didn't do anything militarily regarding this. That's a long time to hold a vessel. I mean, we've seen vessels grabbed here and there by countries, not unusual for that to happen. But for the Iranians to hold this vessel for 3 months and then to extort a promise to release $7 billion in frozen capital because of Iranian sanctions, I think that's, this is something we've seen in the maritime industry before, where vessels get detained. I mean, the most famous were back in the early 2000s with the Somali pirates happening. But this is a nation state. This is Iran grabbing a South Korean flag vessel, and the implications I think are tremendous going forward for potential further demands. If the Iranians can do this with South Korea, what can they do with other nation states?
And it's not an isolated incident, right? There's all these news reports of various explosions and limpet mines and other security incidents, and Iran working with countries in South America. So there's seems like a lot of Iranian maritime news. There's security concerns, again, in the Straits of Hormuz with these kind of Iranian gunboats going in and harassing tankers. And, President Trump was, pretty forceful or pretty vocal about these incidents, and it's kind of been silent. The end of the Trump administration and then now the beginning of the Biden administration, you haven't heard much from Washington, but now some of that talk may or may. So can you paint that larger picture for us, Sal?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a question about what the Biden administration will do at this point. I think the Iranians were pretty clear what the Trump administration's perspective was, and I think they were very concerned about strikes from the Trump administration. Again, Trump administration killed the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in a strike in Baghdad, targeted strike. They were willing to use strikes against the Iranians. I think you also have a story going on at the same time here that an Iranian vessel got attacked in the Red Sea. This Iranian Navy support vessel, kind of their expeditionary support base vessel, got attacked in the Red Sea. So I think we can see a possible increase in uncertainty in shipping. I mean, you got to go back to the 1980s, the tanker war, where it was just pure, unadulterated, missile attacks on tankers. And again, I always go back to that because it didn't stop the flow of oil at all. Even though tankers were getting hit left and right, you still saw, Persian Gulf oil continue to flow. It's interesting that the commercial shipping, regardless of the strikes and deaths that were going on a routine basis, including American ships getting hit, still continued to flow. I think this poses a bigger issue down the road in that the Iranians are willing to grab nationally flagged vessels. One of the issues has always been, well, if they're Panamanian registered or Liberian, what protection does a state provide that vessel? But this is a South Korean owned and flagged vessel. And the South Korean Navy is not an insignificant Navy in many ways. So they're pretty, impressive force with fairly modern Aegis equipped destroyers. They have the ability to power project beyond the East China Sea, the East Asia area here. And yet, we see this. It'll be interesting to see what goes forward with this. I think it does raise some questions. I think what we'll see in the commercial aspect, do we see increased insurance rates? Do we see increased fuel costs for oil coming out of here? We're already seeing that with the closure from the Suez Canal, causing a spike in fuel rates right off the bat.
And it's not just the South Korean Navy which can defend and release this, but they obviously have, a lot of defense treaties. I think is it our largest overseas army base is in Korea, so we have close ties with the United States. So that's, there aren't many. It's difficult. It would be difficult to take an American ship because there just aren't very many of them left. So this could be a move to take some of our allied tonnage, right?
Exactly. And I think this is one of those bridges that we see that connects the civilian and military side that we talk about a lot, that, the military doesn't look at the civilian side, the civilian doesn't really look at the military side. And here you see that interaction right here. I think that plays out. The second story we're going to look at was one that you talked, or we were going to talk about here, was from Mike Schuller, the editor at gCaptain, really recommended, was talking about how the global supply lines are struggling to clear that container backlog after the Suez. We got Ever Given out. Seems like ages ago now, but it's not too long ago. The Suez Canal Authority did an amazing job of clearing the backlog. I still think they're not exactly clear yet. I still think they're about a day or two behind getting back to where they normally are. We had a little bit of a scare the other day with a Italian tanker losing propulsion in the southern channel, very close to where Ever Given was. A couple of hours there with a backlog, but they were able to move her out. But now this report talks about the ships heading to Europe, to Felixstowe, to Hamburg, to Algeciras, to the major container terminals, and the potential for backlog really starting to hit. We haven't seen that yet. So I was wondering if you could comment about that a little bit.
Sure, and I was looking at AAS a couple hours ago. The Ever Given is still in the bitter end lake there in the Suez Canal, anchored. So there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of very expensive cargo. Some estimates up to $1 billion in cargo is now sitting there. Will they take it off? Will they light or remove it? So you have that cargo specifically, and then you have the Suez Canal cargo, and we've talked about it before. Everything is just-in-time shipping. So they used to have these big warehouses at a factory, and they had ball bearings and all the parts for up to a year. And then So they could continue production for a year without any supplies. Then they reduced it to 6 months, but they realized there's a huge fee to storing all this, and you got to hire security guards, and stuff can rust. And so there's this huge storage fee. So they went to just in time. They only order it exactly when they need it. And so these container ships have been slotted to show up at pretty much an exact time. And then you have these 20,000 containers coming, which means you need a truck for every container that comes in. And they have to show up at the right time, and they got to get to the factory just before they run out of parts. And this ship shows up at 0900 on Thursday, this one at 0930 at Dock C. It's very much now like an airport terminal where you have the exact times. And but it's probably even stricter. There are fewer delays because they're these big ships, and they know how long it will be to offload it. Well, we just took all of the ship traffic, and it was all laid out and all this, and it's like a giant Monopoly game. And we took it, we threw it in a bag and shaked it up, because some went around the Cape of Good Hope, some went through the Suez, some were delayed, some weren't. And that's the logistical challenge now. How do you rebuild this Monopoly game? And I think we're going to see these factories and stuff kind of fall behind. But this doesn't live alone, right? We had a major container shortage just before the Suez Canal happened, and we're having major backups in certain ports, especially in the West Coast of the United States. I was just on the phone with the pilot of one of the large ports in the West Coast, and it's absolutely crazy. And certain things are coming in that you don't really realize. Like, coming into San Francisco, you have all this, so you have this big delay. Well, you have pilots, you have a limited number of pilots. So you want to bring more ships in, you need more pilots, but it takes years to train a new pilot. So you can't just throw a new pilot into the thing. So some of these pilots in some of the ports are getting tired and overworked, and, where do you anchor them? And all these other problems kind of come into play.
Well, I think that comes into the infrastructure that we're talking about, because one of the things that you're talking about, that just in time, again, you don't need those big warehouses to store things, because these ships are now the big warehouses. They're mobile warehouses that are just delivering the cargo just as you need them. And as you said, it's not just, and this is the issue I talk about a lot, is you can't just talk about the maritime sector. You got to talk about the shore sector. You got to talk about trucks. You got to talk about rail. You got to talk about all those elements there, because when you dump 15,000 containers in a port, you got to get them off the port. There's got to be trucks available. There's got to be chassis available. There's got to be drivers available. And that just creates, like you said, with pilots is another good example right there. Yeah, you're going to be handling the same amount of vessels in these ports, but they're designed to be spread out. Now, all of a sudden, they come in big, huge, waves, instead of this being a nice straight line of vessels coming in 2 at a time every day. Now you're getting pulses coming in, and that's hard to deal with. And I think, again, the unintended consequences of a disruption, even though it was only 6 days, is going to resonate through the system. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now is, because of the delay, it doesn't hit right away. It lags, because, again, the cargo is still being distributed from the vessels from the previous week. Now the vessels that should have been offloading this week and their cargo being distributed is not being distributed. And now you have ports that don't normally have vessels waiting, like Rotterdam and Felixstowe. They're not, they're big terminals, but they don't have big, huge waiting areas for their vessels. They're used to them coming in at set times, offloading and being off berth and heading into the next one. And like you said, this just jumbles up the whole Jenga pile here, and you got to kind of restack and rebuild. And
the companies are reluctant normally at this time, when you have these freight rates going sky high and the container ship companies are rolling in dough, they start this building. And we have had some announcements of new builds, but then there's this huge question of IMO 2030. No one really knows how to meet the efficiency standards. So they don't want to build and then have the ship be illegal in 2030. So you have all of these factors. And then, I struggle as a publisher. I mean, gCaptain's a publisher, and we can highlight certain areas, and some are hot, some areas like the pilots and these pictures of the backlog and where they anchor them. And those things are hot. And some of the short sea shipping initiatives and the new money going into there are hot. People are interested in reading it. And then there are topics that people are very interested in reading. But, as a publisher, we got to shy away from a little bit because there are other political, like the longshoremen in the port and how quickly they work. And, we write about that and we're suddenly going to get a lot of phone calls from important people, which we're not against doing. We just don't have the resources as a small publisher to answer all. We can very easily get congested and back up our other stories. And then you have stories which are very, very important, which no one gives a beep about, which is how we started this conversation. What are we going to talk about this week? And Sal wanted to talk about the Federal Maritime Commission. And I said, do we want to put people to sleep? So very briefly, what is the Federal Maritime Commission and why should I care?
Well, let me pivot with that to this. I mean, again, we're talking about these backlogs, we're talking about this impact, but at the same time, container ports is a story you guys just had on gCaptain, that the Port of Long Beach had the busiest month on record in March, and then, the trade is booming. I mean, it's just absolutely phenomenal, the amount that's coming in here. And the Federal Maritime Commission, which is basically the entity that oversees Americans' import-exports and basically the regulations, and more importantly, for American shipping, those who want to ship via these foreign flag commerce, this is where they go to with issues. So one of the things you mentioned, which is a kind of an abstract concept, it's hard to understand at times, is because of the demand, one of the issues is how do you get rid of these excess containers, these empty containers? You have to reposition containers around the world. You don't want to continually build new containers because that's expensive. You'd much rather use empty containers. The problem is, where we tend to be a net importer versus exporter, right now, because of the slowdown, exports are piling up. So vessels are sailing back and forth between the United States, and we're going to see this in Europe right now because of the slowdown there. They're going to be fully loaded going back and forth. There's not going to be empty containers on that, which means that the offload of those containers takes time, which means that if you're packing, you have goods ready to move, you can't wait for an empty container. You've got to buy a new one now. That raises costs. And it just becomes more expensive. And what the Federal Maritime Commission is dealing with is protests by American, specifically agriculture exporters, saying that, listen, we got goods on the dock that aren't being moved. We can't get them moved. And as our representative, as the Federal Maritime Commission, you should be able to intercede with these big companies to get them to move. The problem I have with the FMC is they've been taking this under advisement since March. Not March last year, not March this year, March last year. So, 13 months they've been studying the issue, and they tend to be very...
Well, it takes time because all the members of the Federal Maritime Commission are captains and people like you who have dedicated their entire lives to studying marine transportation problems, right? Is that the expert panel that the FMC is? I know we have a new FMC commissioner.
The new chairman of the FMC is, a former congressman, and it tends to be more political appointed. Now, the one who's looking at it right now, Rebecca Dye, I think is very well qualified. I think.
So to be clear, I was being sarcastic there. These are people who have to spend a lot of the beginning of their terms getting up to speed in the topic because a lot of them are not from the industry.
Now, Rebecca Dye, who's one of the commissioners who's looking at this, has been doing this for a long time. So I think she has got a lot of experience in doing this. But again, it goes to the larger issue that this is one that doesn't get a lot of resonance with everybody. We just don't tend to.
I know. I'm falling asleep right now just hearing it, listening to you. But
I know it's
important.
It is important. I think this image. One of the things I always love about gCaptain is the images. This is the image of the Port of Long Beach right there, and you get an appreciation of the scale we're talking about right there. You see, berths are full. I got one empty berth right here, but probably ship moving on and off. Cranes are in use. And you only have so much laydown area with containers to move things. We're really constrained in the size of these terminals and berths.
It's a real estate problem. And that's what I won't go into my short sea shipping rants. I think you've read some of my articles and I posted a video, but people are like, well, let's just put a container terminal in the Bronx to supply all the food in the Bronx. And there are two problems with that. One problem is it's not the incoming food from the container ships that's a problem, the couple thousand trucks that come in. It's the tens of thousands of trucks that are going out distributing every day. That's the problem. But number two is this containers are really a real estate problem.
Yeah.
So people talk about the throughput. When you're talking in container terminals, it's all about the throughput. How many containers can you get through every hour, every day, every month? And that goes back to the longshoremen, and there's always fights about automation and who's quicker. But that's what the container companies care about. But as you get to the next level, it's throughput. It's how many containers per acre per year. So I think that the most efficient ports in the world do 7,000 to 8,000 containers per acre per year. So, and it's valuable real estate right downtown Los Angeles and Long Beach, right?
And that's always the problem is where you want your port to be is close to where you want your goods distributed, but that makes it expensive to do that. And I would add another layer to it that you didn't mention, but I think is very critical, is security issues, Homeland Security, CBP, INS, all these things. These containers need to be inspected, screened. You had a story about an MSC vessel, Mediterranean Shipping Company vessel that got basically arrested because of cocaine, 20 tons of cocaine on board the vessel. And again, that's a security issue.
I thought we were after 9/11, we were going to inspect 90% of these.
Yeah, and how many get inspected now? It's a fraction of that get inspected. We're lucky if we're around 2 to 3% because of the volume of containers coming in. And this is a big issue. It's a massive issue because
the fact when people think when you open a container, you see all the goods like opening the back of a truck. But when you open the side of a container, all you see is a wall of cardboard boxes, and you take those boxes and there's another wall. So it's time consuming taking all that junk out.
And it's impossible to do it for container. It really is. When you have a 40-foot container, to remove everything, you're back to doing break bulk movement, which was the old way of moving things. And again, you talked about this the other day, and I pulled off the shelf just yesterday 2 books on containerization. Mark Levinson's The Box you talked about the other day.
Love that book.
And then Brian Cudahy's book on box ships. And I looked at those were both written in 2006 on the 50th anniversary of containerization, commemorating that. And if you look at the size of the vessels and the number of ships and container slots out there, in 2006, the 2 top lines today have as many container slots as the entire world did in 2006. And it's just a quantum leap difference in the volume numbers we're dealing with here. And again, that has a problem with.
But how much have the ports increased, right?
Right,
yeah.
And that's the issue you have. It's not surprising. You see the development of new ports in Savannah, for example, and Charleston, and Charleston. You said a story about Charleston opening up a new container terminal, and but that's expensive. It's really costly, and that brings us to the story that you wanted to talk about that I want to kind of end us on here.
But we're really, really quickly there. What else happens that I've noticed is we focus on our pain, right? So probably a bad example, but I remember I was reading a history about one of the biggest problems centuries ago was gout, the inflammation of the foot, and they tried everything. They tried bleeding the foot, but everything was focused on the foot, where it turns out it was really the diet and the sugars and the meat that you're doing. So I'd say it's the same problem with every solution you have to containers. Let's dredge more, let's bring more space, but it all is focused on the container. And the container is a wonderful invention. It's not going anywhere soon. But once it hits the port, it's great for moving across the ocean. But once it hits the port, it's not a good solution. But the ports can't think literally, they can't think outside the box because that's where their pain is.
Well, and then you add another level to it, which doesn't get talked about at all, really a lot, is a lot of times these containers, which again are supposed to be intermodal, put them on the back of a chassis and transport. In the case of the United States, we've adopted 53-foot trucks. There's no 53-foot containers. And so what you're seeing them do in some cases is take 2 40-footers or 3 40-footers and pack them into 2 53-footers. So you're actually negating the process here because you're opening up the containers, you're repacking again to put them
take it out, put it on a pilot, and it's more than that because again, those containers are well packed. But once you put it on a pallet, you can only fit a few pallets in. You can fit a lot in a truck, and a lot of the trucks don't go full. Right, the biggest increase in volume in trucking nowadays is LTL, less than truckload. So. That Home Depot only needs the 3 pallets and that one needs 5 pallets, and we're not good at consolidating Lowe's and Home Depot and Whole Foods aren't sharing the container to make sure it's efficient.
Yep,
They're each sending partially full trucks out.
And that's one of the things that really kind of impacts against us, because again, we focus on the maritime side, but again, you need to look at this holistically, but again, we have divided it up across the government. We have a Department of Transportation, a Department of Commerce, a Department of Interior, a Department of Labor, when all those things come to play here at the same time. And when you don't have someone over the maritime, at least on the American side, in my opinion.
At all. There's no one there, right?
Right. Well, not only is there no one there, but then it's split between the Maritime Administration and the Federal Maritime Commission. And they have
But weren't they both in the Department of Commerce?
They were. It was combined until 1961 when they split it apart. And again, it's not like the FAA, which has one kind of, person in charge. And
wait. A pilot in charge.
Right.
Can we make that clear?
Yeah.
A pilot. When was the last time a captain was in charge of MARAD? That's a good historical question.
It is a good historical question. You're probably going to go back to Liebeck. I think that's probably the last one. I would have to go back and take a look and see it. But let's get to the last story, because again, this is a story that you talked about, but I think it's a great one to look at is why Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan will fail. I mean, we talked about if you look at the Biden administration right now, they've come out, in favor of the Jones Act in a proclamation. They said that, that's the coastal trade in the United States. They've talked about putting money into ports. They've talked about specifically putting $17 billion, I think, into ports and everything. And yet, this piece, which you talk about in a whole separate video, which we'll link to and people can watch, why is it that this $2 trillion infrastructure plan you think is going to fail?
Well, I got a lot of heat from that because first of all, we had the Obama administration.
John, you got heat for something.
We had the Obama administration where that MARAD, it wasn't filled for years, and then it was filled temporarily, and then they got an 06 submarine. He wasn't even a Navy captain in there. So nothing was happening. So when nothing happens, I can't report as gCam on anything. So we didn't report much. And then Trump comes in and has all these initiatives and all these programs and all these, and we were critical of many of them, not all of them. And then we get this thing, they're anti-Trump, right? They're this liberal bleeding heart. And so we really confused people when we came in at Biden, because Biden is doing something with not maritime. I haven't seen any evidence of any maritime, but he's doing infrastructure, and infrastructure includes ports and bridges. So people are like, well, you're critical. I thought you were super, so that I'm just giving a little insight into the struggles of gCaptain. We try to see partisan and bias, but there's so much lacking in the maritime world that it's hard not to be critical, right? Because all these programs fall apart. And even someone like the Trump administration who tries, they often fail because you don't have the congressional support. You don't have all these interdepartment support. So as a news organization, all we can tell is the truth, not what we want it to be, but what happened. This thing fell apart. And so what was your question? So I get over that rant.
Well, we're talking about this $2 billion infrastructure bill. Why
it will fail. Why I was critical of the Biden administration.
Maritime sector.
Again, because it's that pain in the foot. We look at the container. Right now we have pain in the roads. Our roads are congested. Our bridges are falling apart. But people don't realize the why. The why is the weight. The weight, and you have a whole hundreds of millions of dollars going in Silicon Valley to drones and Elon Musk with the tunnels and all this. But it comes down to a weight. It's the Newton force of lifting 1 kilogram, 1 foot in the air. People think ships are efficient because of the low friction, but it's really, there are no hills on the ship. And once you get a truck up on that on-ramp, it's putting immense amount of weight on the bridge, which is tearing our roads apart, and also burning a lot of emissions, trying to go up the hill. And trains are 3 times more efficient than trucks because they don't have to brake in traffic, right? Every time you brake, you're taking that enormous amount of weight in the train and stopping it. And then you got to need an enormous amount of force. So I think it's a physics problem, but you don't have any physics experts in looking at these problems. They're just fixing, they're not looking at, they're looking at the symptoms, not the overall illness. The illness is that these containers were not designed, and it's illegal to bring them into our most congested area, which is cities, right? You can't even if you want to, you can't bring a container in. And so how really quickly can you tell us what Malcolm, envisioned and why that fell apart?
Well, McLean, I mean, when Malcolm McLean came up with this in 1956, he came up with a 35-foot box. He figured that was the box, that was the right size. He can get into areas. He never envisioned the numbers, obviously, the size that we're talking about here. His concept was just to reduce the number of, because he saw the big issue being handling, the amount of times you handled the cargo, and more importantly, the pilferage that was going on. You were losing cargo every time someone put their hands on it. And
the port congestion, he was a truck driver and he was sitting in the port,
Red Hook,
waiting online, watching the other trucks get unloaded by hand.
He's sitting there in Red Hook and realizes that the scope and scale of this is inefficient. I'm sitting here in a truck, the cargo's got to be moved multiple times. It's just inefficient method to do it. The problem we have now is we've gone to the flip side scale, is we've pushed the efficiency that we get from the containers into inefficiency because of the number of containers we have. When somebody argues with me that hey, the Jones Act is a hindrance because we could be able to move containers from Seattle.
Who would argue with you about that?
They argue about it all the time. But it'd be more efficient to put a container in Seattle on a vessel and move it to Los Angeles than by rail. And I say you're completely wrong. It's not. I can drive a truck 27 hours and be from Seattle to Los Angeles. I am not going to get a cargo down to Los Angeles in 27 hours. But more importantly, I've got to go through 2 ports, which is going to add days to it, handling and charges, because the only terminals I can go through are the big terminals. I can't go through anything smaller because nothing smaller handles a container. And I'm going to be at the back of the line to get my short sea shipping done. And again, what the problem we have is where McLean thought containerization was the solution. He didn't envision 20,000 box vessels. He didn't envision one cargo per box. He thought Home Depot would, everything that they needed that week would be packed in China and go and end up at the end store. But like you say, it's got to be unpacked at multiple warehouses and split to trucks and divided off. We've gotten out of the idea of seal the container and it arrives at the destination. We've gotten away from that. And the more handling we put on these boxes.
Because again, you need those heavy cranes, and Home Depot is not installing one of those cranes at every location to start handling shipping containers.
No, because they're not taking the containers off. They're just unpacking the containers there. And they're not, like you said, they're not unpacking the entire containers. They're just taking what they need off there. Or better yet, the truck is traveling half empty, and it's just completely inefficient method of moving goods. And that's what we're seeing right now. Again, we can keep throwing money into developing these ports, making it bigger, more cranes, more all of this. But until the highway, that's what made Savannah a very interesting port to develop, because it's right there, short little, sea voyage in from the buoy to the dock. It's right there at I-95, I-20. There's a railway there. There's an airport there. It's not a tremendously large city. And so you can develop ports like that. Los Angeles, Long Beach, you're not going to develop it anymore. You've used all the area unless you start doing what China has done and create artificial ports off the port. But we're never going to be able to do that in the United States. You're sure not going to be able to do that in California. I don't think you're going to be able to start using spoil to start adding to the port there. But
we did for centuries in New York, though, right? I mean, you talk about the Twin Towers and the trade, that was all filling, right?
That's right. But again, you don't bring those ships in there because, again, the finger piers don't work. That's why Newark exists. But again, what we saw with Newark is you had to raise the Bayonne Bridge. You had to do all this elements to keep it going. Be much more efficient to, create a port off of New Jersey, Earl or someplace out of the way, which doesn't exist today. That's why Felixstowe in Great Britain, Algeciras in Spain became these big terminals because there wasn't much there to begin with. But again, that requires innovation. It requires money. It requires a lot of leadership, which I would argue is deficient right now in not just the maritime industry, but in all the industries that have to be brought together to make this work.
And knowledge, I've worked, I was consulted with Google and Google Maps and such, and they had a failure of a barge project. And, you have all these things, but, we're a highly regulated industry, so you can't just do what Uber does and break the law and pay the fine later and say, I apologize. The Coast Guard, which is a military organization, will shut you down. But you also don't have, there's no Americans here who understand maritime. So, I mean, Google has trouble hiring, Amazon, they can't hire maritime experts. The FMC is happy to hire someone to be in charge who's not a captain, and so is MARAD. But you talk to the Amazons, you talk to the Google, they want someone who is an expert, a captain, or a logistic expert, something in that slot to do the innovation. And there just aren't very many of us. There certainly aren't very many of us who also know how to program computers, right?
No, and that's, that's true. I mean, lots of times you'll see them bring in admirals, but, I would argue that military is different than commercial. And sometimes, taking a master off the, a bridge, or a chief engineer off the deck plates, after 30 years of doing that, they don't transition well into the boardroom and to talking to people in a way you need to have a communication with. And again, I'm looking for that maritime Shark Tank to, come in the United States. We see it in Rotterdam, we see it in Europe, we see it in Asia all the time, where, there's that.
Port Excel in Rotterdam, excellent. I was there last year, and oh man, they're doing amazing things, but still have trouble with that funding. And you also have the problem, I mean, entrepreneurship. I was watching a speech by Jordan Peterson, who's now popular, and his Tim Ferriss show, and talking about innovators are chaotic, and people who, CEOs of company and people who do well in government are very structure-based, right? People like me who are chaotic and start companies do not do very well in structure-based. So you have this problem. So, you can't, I'd say, call me. I'd be happy to be maritime administrator and give you these new ideas, because the ideas blow out of my head, but I chafe and work against this. But, what we really need is a maritime administrator like you, Sal. And I'm not doing this to make you flatter you or anything else, but we need someone who understands the chaotic mind, understands the structure mind, but most of all can communicate both. That's what we need, someone to get on YouTube video and that skill set of a professor, where you can get people interested in things like the FMC, which I didn't want to talk about. And now I'm interested in it. Now I want to learn a little more.
Well, I think
because of your communication skill, not because of anything I've read from the FMC.
There's another reason too. I think as we both know, the maritime industry is very stovepipe. Ship builders are shipbuilders. Ship operators are ship operators. Unions are unions, and usually they communicate among themselves. They don't like to talk about each other.
And Americans are Americans, and Brits are Brits, and we don't communicate well.
Someone's gain is someone's loss. There's the perception that the pie is finite. It's not infinite. And so anytime I advance, somebody loses. And unfortunately, someone like you, who's a media person who looks at the news, you can look at it and see all parts and give perspectives from all parts. I, as a professor, as an academic, can sit there and gauge from a distance and really make an assessment. And, I'm not impacted by it one way or the other. So, John, we're coming up on the end of our time. We don't want to go too far. I would argue that we should, next week we'll come back with another episode. I would ask everyone to tune in, subscribe, get gCaptain, get the newsletter, which I do, so I can keep abreast of everything. Look what's happening in the news. As we've been talking, news stories are breaking all the time, talking about China and its high price ban on Australian coal, which is leading ships to anchor off the coast of China, waiting to offload. Who knows what next week holds? Can't tell where the Ever Given will be. Will the Egyptians raise the $1 billion stake to release the Ever Given? Maybe we should start a GoFundMe page to get the Ever Given loose and everything like that. Maybe that's something we think about going forward.
And the final word, DOT, please call Sal, our next maritime administrator. And I have talked to some people. I have some sources very high in the government, and they say, we're trying to really push minorities and women, which I'm a big supporter of. Organization of Black Maritime Graduates, go check them out. Women Offshore, go check them out. Sal, they said, does Sal fit in those? I said, look at his head. I mean, is there anyone more follically challenged? I think that's a qualifying aspect there.
There isn't, John, and on the fact of my baldness being the end of our first get-together, I think that's an appropriate way to know how this is going to go forward, weekly going on. So on behalf of my follically challenged head, on behalf of John's very small diminutive head, based on the size of his headphones right there, I'm Sal Mercogliano. That's John Konrad. We're going to be back next week talking about more maritime news from gCaptain Weekly. So thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.